It was one of those mornings that felt heavy from the start. The air outside the courthouse was thick, and the sound of people's shoes echoed sharply against the marble floors. Among the rush of lawyers in suits and clients carrying stacks of papers, a young boy walked in quietly, holding a thin folder close to his chest. He looked lost, almost like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. But this was exactly where he was supposed to be, in court, defending himself. He couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. His clothes were neat but clearly not new, and his shoes had small scratches that showed they had seen better days. His hair fell slightly over his eyes, and he kept pushing it back nervously. Anyone watching him could tell he wasn't used to being in a place like this. The courthouse was big, bright, and full of people who looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. He didn't. As he reached the courtroom door, he took a deep breath. He had practiced this moment 100 times in his mind, but somehow it all felt different now. His heart was pounding so hard that he could almost hear it. He stepped inside. The courtroom was already full. On one side sat the people from the company that had filed the case against him. Sharp suits, serious faces, confident body language. On the other side, a few people sat quietly, waiting for their own cases to be called. The boy walked to the empty table at the front where the defendant usually sat. As he pulled out the chair, it made a small squeaking sound that echoed in the silent room. A few people turned their heads. He sat down slowly, trying to hide the shaking of his hands. Then came the judge. Everyone stood up as she entered. A woman in her late 50s, calm but strict-looking, known for her sharp humor and strong opinions. The boy had heard stories about her. Some said she was fair but tough. Others said she had no patience for people who wasted the court's time. When everyone sat down again, she began looking through the list of cases. Then she looked up and called his name. Her tone was neutral, but the way she raised her eyebrow when she saw him said a lot. She looked surprised and maybe even amused. "So you're representing yourself?" she asked, glancing at the boy. He nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." Her lips curved into a small smile. "You don't have a lawyer?" He swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." A soft chuckle escaped her mouth. It wasn't loud, but it was enough for the courtroom to hear. Some people smiled quietly. Others exchanged quick looks. The boy's ears turned red. He lowered his gaze to the folder in front of him. The judge leaned back slightly in her chair. "You know this is a civil case, right? Against a company with professional legal representation. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Her voice wasn't cruel, but it carried that tone adults often use when they think a young person is about to make a mistake. The boy nodded again. "I'll do my best." The judge sighed softly and motioned toward the opposing attorney, a tall man in a gray suit, confident and clearly experienced. "Very well. Let's proceed." The attorney stood up, adjusted his tie, and started speaking. His voice filled the room like it had been there 1,000 times before. He talked about contracts, agreements, clauses, and terms that most people wouldn't understand without a law degree. He moved through his arguments smoothly, almost rehearsed, flipping through papers like a teacher showing off in front of a class. The boy sat quietly, eyes fixed on the attorney. Every time the lawyer said something, he wrote a small note in his folder. His handwriting was neat, almost too careful. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just focused. When the lawyer finished, he gave a confident look toward the judge, then at the boy as if to say, "Let's see what you've got now." The judge turned her attention back to the young boy. "All right," she said with a light sigh. "Now you may speak. Tell us your side." The boy's throat went dry. He stood up slowly, the papers in his hand trembling slightly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out for a second. The silence stretched. Someone in the back coughed. The boy finally spoke, his voice soft, almost too quiet for the room. I just want to explain what really happened," he began. A few people smiled faintly. Some shook their heads. The judge rested her chin on her hand, clearly not expecting much. The boy cleared his throat and continued. His voice was still shaky, but he managed to speak clearly enough for everyone to hear. He talked about how he had signed a small contract with the company for a summer project. He explained that it was supposed to help him earn money for college. But things hadn't gone as planned. Somewhere along the way, a misunderstanding turned into an accusation, and now he was being sued for something he didn't do. The lawyer interrupted a few times, using big legal terms to make him sound confused. The judge didn't stop him. Each interruption made the boy's confidence drop a little more. Still, he kept going. He explained how he had sent emails, made phone calls, and tried to fix the situation on his own before it ended up in court. But no one had listened. As he spoke, some people in the courtroom started whispering again. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him feel small. One of the clerks even smiled a little when he stuttered. The judge chuckled again when he mixed up a legal term, shaking her head slightly as if she couldn't believe this boy was trying to handle a case by himself. Inside, the boy's chest tightened. He wanted to run out, to leave everything behind. But he didn't, he stayed. He held on to the small folder like it was the only thing keeping him standing. The judge looked down at her notes. "All right," she said finally. "I think I've heard enough for now. We'll take a short break." The gavel struck lightly and everyone stood up again. The courtroom began to fill with low chatter. The boy sat down slowly, staring at the folder on the table. He could hear people laughing quietly as they left the room. One of them whispered, "This kid doesn't stand a chance." He didn't look up. He just sat there, breathing slowly, trying to calm himself. When the room was almost empty, he took out a small notebook from his bag. It was filled with notes he had written over weeks, late nights, early mornings, every free moment he had. He went through them again, page by page. His hand stopped shaking. His face relaxed a little. The nervous boy who had walked in earlier seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone more focused, more determined. He looked toward the judge's empty seat and whispered under his breath, "I'm not giving up." Outside, through the window, the city moved on, cars honking, people hurrying to work, unaware that inside this courtroom, a young man was about to do something that would surprise everyone. He took one last look at his notes, closed the folder, and sat back. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were calm now. The fear was still there, but behind it was something stronger. Quiet confidence. When the courtroom doors opened again and people started coming back, the boy didn't move right away. He waited, breathing steadily. The judge returned, her expression unchanged. She didn't know that the boy who was about to speak next would no longer be the same shy kid she had laughed at before. The bailiff called the room to order again. The sound of chairs and footsteps filled the air. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at him. "All right," she said. "Let's continue. Are you ready, young man?" He stood up, nodded slowly, and replied in a firm but calm voice, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm ready." This time his voice didn't shake, and though no one knew it yet, this was the moment everything would start to change. The courtroom settled down again as everyone returned to their seats. The young boy stood behind his small desk, holding that same folder like it was his only shield. His heart was still beating fast, but something inside him had changed. He was still scared, but now he was also determined. The judge cleared her throat and looked over at the lawyer representing the company. "You may continue," she said firmly. The lawyer gave a polite nod and stepped forward. He was tall and confident, the kind of man who spoke like he had never been wrong in his life. His suit was perfect, his shoes shiny, and his voice smooth enough to fill the whole courtroom without effort. He carried a thick stack of papers that looked heavier than the boy's entire folder. He started talking again, walking slowly across the floor as he spoke. "Your Honor," he began, "the facts are clear. The defendant failed to deliver his part of the agreement, and the company suffered a financial loss as a result." He turned toward the boy for a brief moment, then looked back at the judge. "We are not here to discuss emotions. We are here for facts and evidence." His tone was sharp. Every word was perfectly chosen. He spoke like he already knew he had won. The boy listened quietly, not interrupting. His eyes followed the papers the lawyer was waving around, trying to catch every word. The lawyer went on, explaining how the boy had supposedly broken a contract by not finishing a small project on time. He used complicated words like breach, liability, and damages. Each time he said something, he would glance toward the boy as if daring him to respond. Then he placed a few sheets of paper on the judge's desk. "These are the documents that clearly show the defendant agreed to the company's terms," he said. "You can see his signature right there." The judge looked over the papers carefully. The boy did too. He recognized his signature, but something didn't sit right with him. The date on the paper was slightly different from the one he remembered. Still, he didn't say anything yet. He was waiting for the right moment. The lawyer continued, his voice firm and confident. The company gave him every chance to correct his mistake. They sent reminders, emails, even called him. But he ignored them all. That is why the company had no choice but to bring this matter to court. A few people in the audience nodded quietly, believing every word. To them it seemed simple. A big company wronged by a careless young man. The lawyer's tone made the boy sound like someone irresponsible, maybe even dishonest. When the lawyer finished, he stepped back and folded his hands. "That's all for now, Your Honor. The facts speak for themselves." The judge leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. Then she looked at the boy. "Do you have anything to say to this?" The boy stood up slowly. His palms were sweating again and his throat felt dry. "Yes, Your Honor," he said softly. The judge nodded. "Go ahead." He opened his folder and took out a few papers. They were neatly organized, each one held together with small paper clips. He placed them carefully on the table. His voice was still calm but carried a quiet strength. "I didn't ignore anyone," he said. "I replied to every message they sent. I have the emails right here." He handed the first few pages to the clerk, who brought them to the judge. The judge looked through them with raised eyebrows. "These emails," the boy continued, "show that I asked the company several times for more information. The project details they gave me were incomplete. I told them I couldn't continue until they fixed it, but they didn't respond for almost 2 weeks. Then suddenly they blamed me for the delay." The judge looked at the lawyer. "Is that true?" she asked. The lawyer smiled politely. "Your Honor, those messages may exist, but they don't change the main point. The defendant still failed to deliver the final product on time." The boy took a deep breath. "That's because they didn't give me the right materials. I couldn't complete the work without their approval." The judge frowned slightly. She looked between the two of them. "Do you have proof of that?" The boy nodded and pulled out another paper. It was a printed screenshot of an email exchange. "Here," he said. "This shows that I asked them 3 times for the missing files." The judge studied it carefully, then looked back at the lawyer. "This seems to support what he's saying." The lawyer adjusted his tie and forced a smile. "Your Honor, these could easily be out of context." But for the first time, his voice wasn't as steady as before. The boy noticed it. It gave him a little courage. He looked up and continued, his tone stronger now. "The company told me they would send everything I needed, but they didn't. And when I asked again, they accused me of wasting their time. I didn't want to argue, so I stayed quiet. Then a month later, I received this notice." He lifted a piece of paper, the official court summons. The judge took a slow breath. "I see." The room grew quiet again. Everyone could sense the shift. The boy wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was starting to make sense. The lawyer tried to regain control. He spoke again, a little faster this time. "Even if that's true, Your Honor, the defendant should have sought professional advice. He chose to handle things himself. That shows carelessness." The judge turned her gaze back to the boy. "Why didn't you hire a lawyer?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "I couldn't afford one," he admitted. "I tried to find free legal help, but every office said my case was too small. I didn't have anyone else." His words were soft, but they carried weight. The judge didn't laugh this time. She just looked at him quietly. "I didn't want to give up," he continued. "I know I'm not a lawyer, but I understand what's right and what's wrong. I only wanted to tell the truth." The courtroom was silent. Even the people who had smiled earlier now looked at him differently. There was something honest about his words, something that made people listen. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to move things along. "Your Honor, the company stands by its claim. This case is about business, not feelings." The judge raised her hand slightly to stop him. "Enough for now," she said. "We've heard both sides. We'll continue with the evidence next." The gavel hit the desk softly. As everyone started moving again, the boy sat down slowly. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't won anything yet, far from it, but he had finally spoken up. For the first time that day, he didn't feel invisible. The lawyer walked back to his seat, pretending to stay calm, but he couldn't hide the irritation on his face. He had underestimated the boy. The boy picked up his papers and arranged them neatly. His hand still trembled, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from adrenaline, from the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. The judge stood up to leave the room for a short recess. As she passed the boy's table, she gave him a quick glance, not a smile, not approval, but something different. Respect. When the doors closed behind her, the boy exhaled deeply. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The courtroom felt less cold now. A man sitting a few rows behind leaned forward and whispered quietly, "Good job, kid. You handled yourself well." The boy turned around and nodded politely, a small smile forming on his face. It wasn't much, but it gave him strength. He looked back at his folder again, running his fingers over the papers. He knew the hardest part was still ahead. The real test would come when he presented his full defense. That would be the moment everyone would truly see whether he was just lucky or brilliant. For now, though, he allowed himself a small breath of peace. He had faced laughter, doubt, and fear, but he had stayed calm, stood his ground, and spoken his truth. As the courtroom lights dimmed slightly for the break, he whispered to himself, "I can do this," and deep down, he believed it. The short break ended, and everyone slowly made their way back into the courtroom. The atmosphere felt different now. It wasn't just another simple case anymore. People had begun to sense that something unexpected might happen. The boy who had entered the room hours ago looking scared and unsure was now sitting quietly with a steady look in his eyes. He wasn't smiling, but there was calmness on his face. The same people who had whispered and laughed before were now watching him with curiosity. Even the lawyer, who had seemed so confident earlier, was flipping through his documents a little too quickly, pretending to be relaxed but clearly uneasy. When the judge returned and took her seat, the room became silent again. She looked at both sides, then spoke in a calm tone. "All right, let's continue. I believe the defendant has some evidence he would like to present." The boy stood up slowly, holding his folder tightly. His voice was quiet but clear. "Yes, Your Honor, I have a few things to show." The judge nodded. "Go ahead." He took a deep breath and opened the folder. Inside, there were carefully organized pages, small notes, and printed screenshots. He had spent weeks putting them together. Late at night after his part-time shifts, sitting in the corner of a small library, he walked up to the front, handing a few papers to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Then he turned toward the lawyer's table. "You said the company sent me all the materials on time," he began, "but these are the emails showing they didn't." The judge looked at the papers while he continued to explain. His tone was polite but confident. "The first email I sent was on the 2nd of March. They didn't reply until the 16th. By then, the deadline was already close. I still did my best to finish the work, but it was impossible without their full instructions." The judge's expression changed slightly. She looked interested now. She flipped through the pages, nodding a little as she read. The lawyer tried to interrupt, but she raised her hand. "Let him finish," the boy continued. He pointed out how some of the company's claims didn't match their own documents. "In their report, they said they sent me the final file on the 5th, he said. "But if you look closely, the timestamp shows the 7th. That's 2 days later." The courtroom grew quiet. People leaned forward to look at the papers being passed around. The boy's calm voice filled the room. Every word came from careful preparation and truth. He wasn't trying to sound smart. He was just explaining things the way he understood them. Simple, honest, and real. And maybe that was what made everyone listen so closely. The judge looked up from the papers. "This is quite detailed," she said. "Where did you learn all this?" He smiled shyly. "Just from reading, ma'am. I read everything I could find about contract law online. I also borrowed some books from the public library." A quiet murmur went through the courtroom. Even the court clerk gave him a look of surprise. The judge adjusted her glasses and said softly, "That's impressive." The boy nodded slightly and went on. "I didn't want to waste anyone's time. I just wanted to understand what really happened. I knew I didn't break the agreement, but I had to find a way to prove it." He picked up another sheet. "And here," he said, "this document shows the company's policy about missed deadlines. It says that if the company causes the delay, the employee cannot be blamed for it." The judge looked at the lawyer. "Is that from your company's own handbook?" The lawyer's mouth tightened. "Yes, Your Honor," he admitted quietly. A few people in the audience smiled. The mood had shifted completely. The same boy everyone thought would stumble and fail was now standing tall, turning the whole case around. The judge leaned forward. "It seems to me that you were not given a fair chance," she said. The lawyer quickly tried to recover. "Your Honor, even if there were delays, the quality of the defendant's work was not up to standard." The boy didn't react angrily. He just reached into his folder again and pulled out a USB drive. "I brought a copy of the work I completed," he said calmly. You can see it yourself. The clerk connected it to the court's computer, and soon the project appeared on the screen. It wasn't fancy, but it was done with care. Every part was organized, complete, and clear. The judge looked impressed. "This doesn't look like poor quality work to me," she said. The lawyer tried to respond, but his voice sounded weaker now. "It's not about quality, Your Honor, it's about procedure." The boy nodded respectfully. "Yes, ma'am. And according to the procedure, they were supposed to provide all the materials before the start date. They didn't. I followed every instruction they gave me after that." He opened another document. "Here's the checklist they sent me. You can see the missing items marked in red. Those were never delivered." The judge flipped through the printed pages again. She couldn't hide her surprise anymore. What she saw wasn't the confused or unprepared defendant she had expected. She saw a young man who had worked hard, learned everything on his own, and built a strong case with nothing but truth and persistence. Finally, she looked up and said softly, "You've done your homework well." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Thank you, Your Honor." The lawyer tried one last time to defend his side, speaking quickly and throwing around complicated words again. But now, his words didn't carry the same weight. Every time he said something, the boy calmly showed another document or piece of proof that quietly destroyed his argument. The judge watched closely, sometimes even asking the lawyer questions he couldn't answer. At one point she even chuckled, but this time not at the boy. "You should have come better prepared," she said to the lawyer. A few people in the audience laughed softly. The boy stood still, not gloating, not smiling too much, just quietly relieved that the truth was finally being seen. The lawyer's confidence had completely vanished now. He sat down defeated, pretending to look through his papers again, but everyone could see that he had run out of arguments. The judge turned to the boy again. "Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close for the day?" He nodded and spoke in a calm voice. "Just one thing, Your Honor, I never wanted to fight. I tried to talk to the company before all this. I told them I only wanted to finish my project properly, but they didn't listen. I'm not here to win or lose. I'm here because I had no other choice." His words were simple, but they carried deep emotion. You could hear the sincerity in his voice. It wasn't the kind of speech you'd hear from a trained lawyer. It was the voice of someone who had lived through what he was saying. The judge nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "We'll take this into consideration." The courtroom was silent again, but the silence felt different this time. Warm, respectful. People looked at the boy not as someone foolish or naive, but as someone brave. As the judge ended the session for the day, she gave the boy a look that was almost a smile. "We'll continue tomorrow," she said, "and I must say you've presented yourself very well today." The boy thanked her politely and began to gather his papers. His hands were steady now. The fear that had once filled him was gone. As he walked out of the courtroom, a few people stopped him in the hallway. One man said softly, "You did great in there." "Don't give up," another woman smiled and said. "You spoke better than most lawyers." He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded and thanked them quietly. Outside the courthouse, the sun had started to set. The city lights flickered on one by one. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air. He looked tired, but there was peace on his face. The kind that comes after standing up for yourself when no one believes in you. He sat down on the courthouse steps, watching people pass by. He thought about the judge, the lawyer, and all the faces in the courtroom. And for the first time, he smiled to himself. He had come in scared and uncertain, but now he knew something. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks quietly, with shaky hands and a calm voice, and still changes everything. Tomorrow would be another long day, but he was ready. This was his fight, and for the first time, he was winning it. The next morning came faster than the boy expected. He hardly slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the entire day in the courtroom. The questions, the laughter, the judge's expressions, and every single thing he had said. He kept thinking about what would happen next. He woke up before sunrise, his heart full of both fear and hope. After getting ready, he double-checked his folder again. Every document was neatly arranged. He went through them one last time, not because he didn't trust himself, but because he wanted to make sure there wasn't a single mistake. When he reached the courthouse, the air was cool and the corridors were still quiet. He sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, holding his folder tightly, whispering to himself, "Just stay calm. Tell the truth. That's all." As the clock struck 9, people began arriving. Lawyers with their briefcases, clients with anxious faces, and court staff moving quickly from one room to another. When the doors finally opened, he walked in and took his usual seat. The lawyer from the company was already there, flipping through papers and whispering something to his assistant. His face looked more serious today, like someone who had realized the case wasn't as simple as he thought. When the judge entered, everyone stood up. The sound of chairs and footsteps echoed across the room. Once everyone sat down, the judge looked directly at the boy and said, "We'll begin where we left off yesterday. You may continue your defense." He stood up, feeling his heart race again, but this time his voice was steady when he said, "Yes, Your Honor." He took a step forward, holding a few papers in his hand. "Yesterday I explained how the company delayed sending the materials I needed for my project," he began. "Today I want to show that some of their claims are not accurate." The judge nodded for him to proceed. He handed the first few pages to the clerk. "This is the company's report showing that I failed to submit the final version. But if you look closely at the time records, it says the submission folder was last accessed by someone from their team, not by me." The judge raised her eyebrows and examined the document. "That's true," she said quietly. The lawyer looked up quickly. "Your Honor, that could be part of their internal review," he said. The boy shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. The file access log shows it happened before the project deadline. That means someone from their side opened it before they claimed I didn't send it." The lawyer tried to interrupt again, but the judge lifted her hand. "Let him finish," she said firmly. The boy continued. "When I asked them about it, they said it must have been a system error. But when I checked the timestamp and matched it with their employees' working hours, it lined up exactly. That's not a system error. Someone changed the file and made it look incomplete." A quiet gasp came from one corner of the room. Even the lawyer's assistant looked surprised. The boy walked back to his table, opened his folder again, and took out another paper. "I also have a copy of the original submission email. You can see the attachment right there." The judge leaned forward. "This is starting to sound serious." The lawyer looked visibly nervous now. He rubbed his forehead and whispered something under his breath. The boy continued explaining, showing step by step how the company had tried to cover up their own mistake. Every word he spoke was calm and clear, like someone who had spent countless nights preparing for this very moment. He wasn't angry or proud, just honest. His tone carried quiet confidence, the kind that made everyone listen carefully. The judge asked a few questions, and he answered them without hesitation. When she asked how he found all this information, he said softly, "I didn't have any special tools. I just read everything carefully. Every file name, every date. I wanted to understand what went wrong." The judge nodded slowly, clearly impressed. The lawyer stood up again, trying to take back control. "Your Honor," he said, "even if there was confusion, that doesn't change the fact that the company suffered a loss because the project wasn't delivered properly." The boy looked at him respectfully. "With due respect, sir, the company didn't lose money because of me. They made mistakes in their own system. I have proof that they reused my work in another project. They just removed my name from it." He handed over printed screenshots that showed identical parts of his work being used in the company's later presentation. The courtroom went silent. The judge looked down at the images, then up at the lawyer. "Is this true?" she asked sharply. The lawyer froze for a moment, then said slowly, I'll have to verify that." The judge leaned back in her chair and sighed. "That's very concerning." The boy stood quietly, not saying anything else. He didn't need to. The documents had already spoken for him. For a moment, no one moved. You could almost feel the shift in the air. That moment when everyone realizes that the person they underestimated was far more capable than they thought. The judge finally broke the silence. "You've done an excellent job presenting your case," she said. "Most people with legal training wouldn't have been this thorough." The boy lowered his head humbly. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only wanted to tell the truth." The judge smiled slightly. "And you did." The lawyer looked defeated. He sat down slowly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. The company's case, which had once seemed so strong, now looked weak and full of holes. The boy turned to his papers one last time. "Your Honor," he said softly. I just want to add that I never wanted to be here. I tried to fix this peacefully, but when I received the legal notice, I knew I couldn't just stay silent. I may not know all the legal words, but I do know what's right. His words were quiet but powerful. There was something about the way he said them, honest, pure, unfiltered, that made the whole room fall silent again. The judge nodded slowly. Sometimes, she said, doing what's right doesn't need big words. There was a long pause. Then she turned to the lawyer. Do you have anything else to say? He shook his head silently. His face was pale. The judge looked back at the boy. You may sit down, she said kindly. You've done more than enough for today. As he sat, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. His heart was still beating fast, but this time it was from pride, not fear. He had stood up for himself. He had faced professional systems and doubt, and he had held his ground. The judge took a few minutes to review the papers again. The sound of pages turning was the only noise in the room. Everyone watched quietly as she read, her expression serious but calm. Finally, she set the papers down. This court will review everything and deliver the decision tomorrow, she announced. But I must say the defendant has presented a very strong case. The boy looked down, smiling faintly. He didn't cheer, didn't show excitement. He just felt grateful. When the judge stood up to leave, she gave him one last look, this time not as a boy who didn't belong in a courtroom, but as someone who had earned respect through honesty and hard work. As the gavel struck, the courtroom started to clear. The lawyer packed his things silently, avoiding everyone's eyes. The boy gathered his papers slowly, carefully putting each one back in his folder. When he stepped outside, the hallway felt brighter than before. He walked down the steps quietly, feeling the cool air on his face. A small group of people who had watched the case approached him. One of them said, "You were amazing in there." That was brilliant. He smiled shyly and shook his head. I just told the truth. But deep inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. For the first time in months, he believed in himself again. He sat down on the same bench outside the courthouse where he had sat that morning, tired but peaceful. He looked up at the sky and whispered softly, "Thank you." He didn't know what the final decision would be tomorrow, but he knew one thing for sure. He had already won in a way that mattered more than any verdict. He had proven that courage, honesty, and hard work could outshine even the biggest challenges. And as the sun dipped low behind the courthouse building, he smiled to himself. The quiet boy who once trembled in front of a laughing judge had become the one who made the whole courtroom fall silent with respect. The next morning came with a soft golden light shining through the courthouse windows. The boy stood outside the same building again, holding his small folder close to his chest. His hands were cold, but his heart was calm. The last few days had been exhausting, yet strangely peaceful. He knew this was the final day, the day the judge would give her decision. He looked around at the people walking past him, lawyers talking on their phones, court staff carrying files, people waiting nervously for their cases to begin. Everyone seemed caught up in their own worlds, but for him, this day felt like the biggest moment of his life. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Whatever happens, I did my best." When the doors opened, he walked inside. The same courtroom that once made him feel small and lost now felt familiar. He looked at the empty seat where the judge would soon sit. He looked at the lawyer from the company who sat silently, looking tired and uncertain. There was none of that confidence from before. A few people who had been there during the last hearing were back again, curious to see how it would end. They whispered softly to each other as the boy sat down and placed his folder on the table. After a few minutes, the courtroom door opened, and everyone stood up. The judge entered, her black robe flowing slightly as she walked to her seat. She looked calm but serious. The sound of her gavel brought the room to silence. "Good morning," she said. "We are here to deliver the final judgment in this case." The boy's heart started to beat faster, but he kept his face still. He stared down at his folded hands, trying to stay composed. The judge picked up a few papers from her desk and began reading slowly. "Over the last 2 days, we have heard detailed arguments from both sides," she said. The company presented its claims regarding the contract violation, and the defendant provided a clear and well-supported defense. The courtroom was completely silent. You could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The judge continued, her voice steady. The evidence provided by the defendant shows several key points that cannot be ignored. It is clear that the company delayed providing necessary materials and failed to maintain proper communication with the defendant. Furthermore, the defendant's submitted work was later used by the company in another project without acknowledgement. She paused, looking up at both of them. The lawyer shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. The boy sat perfectly still, listening. The judge spoke again. Based on the evidence, this court finds that the defendant did not breach the contract. In fact, it was the company that acted irresponsibly by accusing him without verifying their own errors. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The boy lifted his eyes slowly. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard it right. The judge looked directly at him now. "You have presented yourself with remarkable honesty and patience," she said. "You stood alone without legal help, yet your preparation, clarity, and respect for this court were exceptional. Not many people could do what you did." The boy felt his throat tighten. He wanted to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. The judge smiled faintly and continued. "The case is dismissed with prejudice. That means this matter is closed permanently, and the company cannot bring it against you again." A soft sigh of relief escaped from him. It felt like a weight he had carried for months had finally lifted from his shoulders. But the judge wasn't done yet. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "When this case began," she said, "I'll admit I didn't expect much. I thought you were just another young person unprepared for the real world. I was wrong." Everyone in the courtroom was listening silently. Even the lawyer looked up now. The judge's eyes softened. "You reminded us all that truth doesn't depend on power or position. Sometimes it just needs courage and patience. You proved that even without experience, a person can stand strong if they have honesty on their side." The boy blinked quickly, trying to hold back tears. He nodded gently, still unable to speak. The judge smiled for real this time. "You've taught us something important. Never underestimate someone because they're quiet or young. Today, this courtroom learned that lesson." The people in the audience began to whisper softly, their faces full of respect. A few of them even smiled at the boy. The judge struck her gavel lightly. "This session is adjourned." As everyone stood up, the boy stayed still for a few seconds. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. Then slowly he stood up, gathered his papers, and turned toward the exit. On his way out, the lawyer approached him. For a second, it seemed like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he said quietly, "You did well. I didn't expect this outcome. Congratulations." The boy nodded politely. "Thank you," he said. There was no anger, no pride, just calmness. As he walked down the hallway, the same man who had encouraged him the day before gave him a thumbs up. "You did it, kid," he said with a smile. The boy smiled back, still in disbelief. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight was warm and bright. He stopped on the steps, looking at the busy street below. Cars moving, people talking, life going on as usual. But for him, everything felt different now. He sat down for a moment, the same place where he had waited nervously just days before. He thought about everything that had happened, the laughter, the doubts, the fear, and finally, the moment the truth came out, he remembered the judge's words. Never underestimate someone because they're quiet. Those words stayed with him. They weren't just about the case. They were about life itself. He smiled to himself. It wasn't a big, proud smile, just a small one full of peace. His phone buzzed. A friend had texted him asking how the hearing went. He typed slowly, "It's over. I won." Then he added, "But more than that, I learned something about myself." He looked up at the sky again. The sun was shining brighter now. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. He got up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and started walking down the street. His steps were steady, his shoulders straight. People passed by him, unaware of what he had just gone through, but it didn't matter.